my figure is today, instead of trying to go through the chapter on integrating drag and drop into our app, because that brings both the complexity of our app and drag and drop at the same time, I thought it might be really nice to try and go through this tutorial that the React drag and drop project has to sort of learn how their code goes together. I think, by the way, if you want something extra to do on your own and sort of learn, this is a really good tutorial. I'll show you some of the things I like about it as a learning tool as we go through it. But that way you'll get a feel for just the way that this is working. And it uses some interesting mechanisms around, interesting tools, interesting approaches for constructing stuff in React, which makes it a challenge trying to do that at the same time we're working in our app. So I think it's nicer to be able to introduce them separately with something just focused on this. So what this tutorial ends up doing, let me see if I can, I think it's got examples here. Let's just see examples. Ultimately, at the end of this tutorial, you end up with this, like an app that essentially lets you move it's not a full chess thing, but it's got one type of chess piece already predefined, and you can move it around based off the rules of chess. So it's pretty, I mean, it's pretty cool to be able to put something like that together going through this tutorial. We'll see how far we can make it through this without trying to push too fast. But it's another great example of how to build something up and how to think in components. Like, because we're learning, you know, React loves this idea of React components as these building blocks that you build up from. So how can we build an app using that mindset, a different one, another chance for us to practice breaking stuff down in these different ways. So the first thing you want to do, and we've talked about this when we have worked on our Kanban app too, is you want to try and identify the components that you're building out, right? So if before we scroll down more, and other people I'm sure are already reading here, but what are the different components or things that you could see in this example of this chessboard here that we might want to build out as components in some way? And I don't think there's, a lot of times there's not a right answer. There's different ways to split stuff up, but
maybe move diagonally.
Move diagonally. That's an action that we'd want to be able to take or whatever. So if we're even just looking at the what we draw, like what this looks like right now, what are the different things that we're trying to draw here to create this UI for this chessboard?
Board.
We're drawing a board of some kind, right? That's a good one. What else are we drawing? A knight.
Just an individual board piece.
What?
Sorry. You're nothing here.
You're not supposed to be here today.
I know.
She's
I'm
right.
recorder.
Hey guys, I can slide down.
No,
Good chair for you. I've got one over here. Here you go.
thank you.
All right, so we could have a board, we could have a knight. Those are good examples. Anything else?
Like the individual areas.
The individual areas, like a square
Yeah.
or something. Yep. Anything else? I mean, maybe there's something else. I don't know. I think that's a pretty good start, right? Because you take a look at it and you say, okay, this is what I sort of have. Now, if we were trying to do a whole chess board, what else would we have?
You
Other
have
pieces.
pawns, the king, queen.
Yeah, you'd have all your other pieces, right? And those would all be probably components as well. But right now, you know, we've just got this. So let's see how they broke it out, because I don't actually remember. I went through this like 2 years ago when I was first picking up React drag and drop. And they break it out. It looks like this sort of the same way we did. They've got a knight, a square, and a board as our pieces, right? So if you're thinking about that now, and this gets into a harder question. So if we say these are our components, what are the properties that you need for the different components to create that component? Or what properties affect that component in some way? So let's talk about the knight. Like, what properties will the knight have that determine how he renders or what he needs to do?
Well, it wouldn't be as many or anything like that because it'd only be on one spot.
Right. So he's in one spot. So how are we going to? That might be a property. What would that be, maybe?
Might be thinking about read, but I'm thinking about like and if or something like that, like an argument, like if it's here.
So you're jumping way ahead into the code. I mean, no, it's great.
Are you
Like-
talking about the squares individually?
Well, let's talk about the knight itself or whatever. Like, what type of properties would you need to have to know how to draw this knight?
How many squares, or would you put in the movement pieces that are allowed? Or you would just let the user know the movements?
Right. I mean, that's possible. All right, let's talk about the board. So if the board has 64 squares, like what properties do you need for the board to draw a board, maybe? I think it's sort of
Really a location
In-
on the board.
for the knight. That's what I would say. That's probably a property of the knight, right? Where he is.
Mhm.
So each time you draw the knight, he's got some sort of property of where his position is. A board, it sort of gives you a hint there at the bottom or whatever, right? Like one property of the board might be how many squares there are, maybe. Now, maybe that's something that is just internal to it, but you might pass that in as a property, like draw this many squares or this many rows. I don't know. What about a square? What might a property of the square be? If we're looking at squares here and we just have
Color.
a color, I think that's a good property of the square. What color is it?
Position.
The position of it might be a property of the square, potentially, right? That would probably be a property of the knight too, is what's his position. Maybe you'll have a property of, and I don't know, some of these may not be in there, right? A knight might have a property of what are his, like, how can he move? What are his legal moves or something? Maybe. He might, one interesting thing about him is we sort of need to draw him differently based on based on where he appears, right? In order to make him visible. So I don't know if it's a property of the knight or how we're going to, again, it's been a long time since I've gone through this tutorial, but thinking about it, okay, we need him to be white there, but we need him to be black here so that he's visible, right? So maybe it's a property of him, or maybe he knows the color of square that he's on or something, and so he can render based off something like that. I'm not sure, but this is part of what you'd be doing if you're building out your own application. Is you're going to try and break it down, like what are these different pieces? Another really good example of that, if you want a good example to practice and sort of learn how to think this way, is the Thinking in React tutorial, which is on the main React site. Does this same thing, right? So these are really good, like, thought things to do, and don't just go right down to their answer first. Look at it and try and break it down. So if we have this, and let's say this is an app, and we're trying to build something that does exactly this, right? We can search for different products. We've got different categories of products, and then we have a product and its price. What might some different, if we broke this down into different components, these UI elements, what are some of the components you could see here? Name, price,
Search.
search,
Electronic. Sporting goods.
like a category component or something, right?
Only show products and stuff. A little check bar.
Right. Yep. And so it's when you're thinking about how to build something, a lot of times somebody will start with a sketch or a design or something. And in React, and it works well in other languages too, but React is particularly useful for this because of the fact that you break stuff down in these components very easily. You can then think about, how would I break this out? So here, they break it down a little bit like this. They sketch it out and say, okay, we've got like 5 different components here. We've got our whole table, right, which is a component that puts everything else together. And then inside of that, we have our search bar. So they just called this whole thing one component. And you could break it down more if you want to. And then they're like, oh, and then we have our whole product table. So all of this is one component. Then you've got like a product category row. So that's this like category. A product row, which is each individual item. And that's, you know, how you sort of broke it down into different components of some kind. So we're doing the same thing over here, is thinking, how do we break it down? What are the components that we need? And then the next step, and I think they even mention it here, is the next step is thinking like, what, we've identified the components. Now, what are the actual properties that the components need in order to render, right? How are we going to get that stuff to render? So that's the next item we're going through here, and it's saying, all right, let's think about props. They say a knight probably needs no properties. So that's interesting. I would have thought maybe the knight had the position myself. It says it has a position, but there's no reason for the knight to know it because it can be positioned by being placed into a square as a child. So we'll see how they do that. You could do it the other way as well. You could have the knight have the position. So there's no requirement that this is the way to build it out, but there might be some advantages we get by having it not have that. Says it's tempting to give square its position via props, but again, this again is not necessary because the only information it really needs for the rendering is the color, right? What color am I? I'm going to make square white by default and add a black Boolean property. And of course, square may accept a single child, the chess piece that is currently on it. So one interesting thing, if you're already thinking about that, is that helps solve one of the questions that we had about the knight. What question does that help us solve?
Whether it's going to be white or black.
Whether it's going to be white or black. Because if it knows that it's rendering a piece on it, it can tell it how to render it, right?
Yeah, the color of the outline.
Yep. Which in my mind would mean that's a prop for this, but maybe it's not. They're doing something different here. I choose white as the default background color to match the browser's defaults. And then board is tricky. It makes no sense to pass squares as children to it, because what else could a board contain? Like, that's sort of what the board does. Therefore, it probably owns the squares, but then it also needs to own the knight because this guy needs to be placed inside one of those squares. This means that the board needs to know the knight's current position. In a real chess game, the board would accept a data structure describing all the pieces, their colors and positions, but for us, a knight position prop will suffice. So it's like we'll use a 2-item array as coordinates, telling you what square you're on, essentially, to match the browser coordinate orientation. I tried it another way and it messed with my head too much. That's just talking about the orientation of the board versus the browser. And then where will the current state live? I don't really want to put it into the board component. It's a good idea to have as little state in your components as possible because the board will already have some layout logic. I don't want to also burden it with managing the state. The good news is it doesn't matter at this point. We're just going to write the components as if the state existed somewhere and make sure that they render correctly when they receive it via props and think about managing the state afterwards. So I hope that that little, I mean, this sentence to me, I think is one of the most powerful bits that's sort of mentioned in this. And I hope that sounds a lot like what I've talked about in class a fair bit, is it's very, very easy when you're programming to get hung up on how are we going to do all of these other pieces? How am I going to build the whole thing at once? But a lot of times the most powerful way to program, like the easiest thing to do is say, oh, if this guy doesn't really care, like he's not the one doing that piece of computation or something, he just gets that value in and does something with it, then I'm going to act like something else has already solved that, even if I haven't, and develop the rest of it as if it's solved. And that way I don't have to worry about solving that right now. I can defer that thinking until later, right? So it's like, how do we hold the state of this position of this thing? I don't know, but I know how to render it on a square. I know how to tell the board where it's at. I know how to, you know, if I solve all those things, then I get to solve those completely independent of maintaining my state. And then I can come back and figure out how do I put the state into it. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges as a programmer, is learning how to do that effectively. But it's also one of the most powerful things you can do, is learning to say, like, I don't know how this problem's solved. And I think the easiest way to think that way when you're programming is if I was, you know, if I'm writing some code and I'm trying to think, like, how do I solve a problem and I don't know what it is yet. And let me think of, we'll do this exact one, right? Is I just think like, okay, I've got some sort of function somewhere. Function, get night position. I don't know what it does. I don't know how it does it. I don't know how it's storing it, but there it is. I've got something that's holding on to that. And if we're concerned with knowing how to set it, I'll act like function set night position, you know, and it'll take a position or something. I don't know the details of that right now, and I'm going to act like it's something I can defer until later and just say, oh, there's something out there that does this for me. And that's what's really useful about thinking about functions like that is I get to act like I don't know how to solve that. Does that make sense as a strategy? So like, I defer that. I just have some sort of function. It does it for me, and I'll deal with how to write that function later. All right, we're going to see how far we get through this. So I'm sort of live coding this up as we do this. And I'm going to give you guys, as part of that, I'm going to do some examples here. Let me remove what I just did. Uh-oh. I got to do it this way. That should work. So the easiest way to get started when you guys start building your own React components as well, or React applications, probably the fastest and easiest way to get started is using Create React App, which is a sort of officially supported mechanism from the React community. So before class, I installed that globally. So you'll see I've got an npm install -g, which is like a global install for npm, this Create React App tool. And you can, you know, if you want to go read on this Create React App, but once you have that installed globally, then it sort of exists at your command line, just like, you know, ls or any of the other commands. So then what we can do is just use Create React App and create a new application for React this way. So this is going to be React drag and drop tutorial. And it's going to do all of the spin up of starting this, building all the underlying framework bits. So you know that the like Webpack and how you build the files and how do I package them up and get things working. This is sort of going to do all that for you behind the scenes and keep it hidden from you unless you need to worry about those aspects. So this is what I would recommend when you guys start building some of your own React applications is Create React App is probably the easiest way to get started. And unless you have some real need or really want to write all that build stuff yourself, go with something like this. Now I haven't tried this inside of Cloud9 before, so we'll see how this goes and if I'm able to run the code correctly or not. We may have some issues. And as it's saying, it might take a couple minutes because it's installing all sorts of bits and pieces for creating this app. So in the meantime, we'll start going through this tutorial before we try and move back over here. As you can see here, they prefer to start from the bottom up. That's the way I like to build React applications too, is starting from the bottom up. I find that depending on the framework or tool you're using, it can vary what makes the most sense. But for React, I think it makes a lot of sense because you can think of it as building up from these smaller atoms and then you build something more complex. So here we start with this night. We're going to build a night component. And this is one of the things I love about this tutorial. You know, I've talked about in class, I've been like, oh, the writer of our other tutorial really has this dense syntax that they love. And sometimes we had to translate it over to, there we go, we up and started. So I don't know if this is going to work. Oh, I need to do the, I know I'm going to need to do this to make stuff work. A little echo command that I never actually mapped to a script. I can't cut and paste. I never mapped to a script to always run, so I know I need to at least do this. Let's see if this works. And you should be able to just run npm start in theory. Sweet, it did work. So this is like the start of Create React App. This is what it gives you out of the box, is a little simple React application. I'm going to close down the Kanban app folder. We've got this separate folder here that we'll work out of, and we're working off of that. We're stepping back over to the tutorial now. We've got our app spun up. We can already start working away, and it's going to be just as easy as the stuff that we've been doing for our Kanban tutorial. Here in this whole React drag and drop tutorial, they've got the ability to see the same things being written out with different approaches. So ES6 is using the classes that are part of the newer version of JavaScript, and we've been writing a lot of our stuff that way or as functional components. But this tutorial also shows the older mechanism for writing out components, which was this create React class, or it used to be like react.create class, but they pulled it out into a separate project. And you'll see this throughout this whole tutorial is multiple versions of the same code showing you how to write it out with different approaches and saying it's really the same thing here. That's one of the things I love about this little tutorial that we have. So here we've got our night, and I'm just going to go ahead and step over here and add a night component. I'll bet you guys didn't know that there's actually a Unicode character for night, so we didn't have to go and import some image or something. This is just using stuff that's built into fonts.
Good question.
Yeah.
The Night.js. So when do you use JSX, or is that?
It's purely optional.
Okay.
You can use JSX or not. JSX is, so file extensions don't actually matter, right? Except for the fact that JSX is just an indication that this isn't pure JavaScript, because if you have any of this JSX syntax stuff like this return span bit, that's not real JavaScript. So early in React, there was very much a common pattern of .jsx files to say like this isn't real JavaScript. And in the community, there's people like both sides. Some people use just .js for everything. They don't care. Some people say, oh, if you're going to have any of this JSX syntax in your file, so it's not pure JavaScript, you should use a .jsx extension. It doesn't really make a difference, except for your build tools may not immediately support like .jsx. You may have to add some support in to say like, oh, a JSX file, you need to build that too.
That's why they went back to JS only.
Well, I would say they haven't gone back. There's just disagreements in the community. So like Airbnb, which a lot of people follow their guidelines, they think everything should be .jsx if it has JSX syntax in it. The React core people now are sort of suggesting that .js, they're like, just use .js. And that's because they're like, if you have a flow syntax, these are other things that you can add in. Like for type checking, you don't want to add .flow as a file type and a whole bunch of other ones. So really the answer is it can be either, and use whatever you're comfortable with. So this one's simple, right? That's a very, very simple component. All we're doing is rendering a span with our little night. Nothing complex. And if we wanted to test that in our Create React app that we have, we could go into our actual app.js file here that's rendering stuff. And this looks like what we have. We've got a header and then something that says like to get started, right? So if we want to test this out with the night bit, we could import night from night. I don't know if that's going to work without .js, but I hope it will. And then we could just render our night component. And because this is hot reloading, there we go, we show up, right? Nice and simple. So then the next piece that we're going to want, if we're building from the bottom up, oh yeah, you can see he's like, I immediately changed my entry point to test it, right? So this is the same thing, except this replaced the whole app bit here, right? Well, the entry point was in this, it's index.js. It's like, here's where you're hooking up all your React stuff. We could do it just slightly differently if we want to. I want to close all these files because we're not going to be using those today. I'm going to let the index still render this app instead. And I'm just going to, let's just get rid of everything that we were rendering before. So inside of this app, all we're doing now is just rendering our, oops, I need the closing div. Rendering the little night for now. There we go. We have a night. He says, I'm going to do this every time I work on another component so that I always have something to render. In a larger app, I would use a component playground like Cosmos, so I'd never write the components in the dark. And you guys can look into that separately if that's something that interests you. But it's a way to build a component without having to have your whole app spun up around it, right? So you can work on individual components one at a time. Like at my job, we've just recently started using something called Storybook. So we can say like, here, render this component. And now we can play with the props, play with how it looks, get it refined without having to spin up all of the rest of the app around it. And then we can be like, all right, we like what that looks like. Now put it into the rest of the application. So it makes for a really fast design and iteration. And so we have our night. The next one, if we're building up from the bottom up, is our square, right? So I'm going to go ahead and take this code and steal it. And you'll see that we've got a few different implementations here, again, showing you how to do it in 3 different ways. ES7, ES6, and ES5. So each one of these are just newer versions of JavaScript. ES5 has been around for a long time at this point, since the mid-2000s. So it's very heavily supported by all browsers. ES6 is still pretty new. It's also known as ECMAScript 2015. So that's when it got standardized, although not all browsers still support necessarily all pieces of it. And then 7 would be the equivalent to 2016, so it's a little newer, has some other features. I'm probably going to take this ES6 one as our base because off the top of, without checking, I don't know if Create React App supports transpiling ES7 code down, but I know that it's going to support ES6. And we'll pull this over and we're going to make this like a square. No, I don't want my Kanban app. So we're going to make a square over here. No. Why does this always happen to me? I don't know what I click wrong. A new file. I know we can talk about what's going on in here for the square, but overall it's pretty simple, right? It's exporting from this component, this square, or from this file, this square component. And in the render, all it checks is it gets the black property off. So we're used to this destructuring to get a value. And then it checks to see if this is true. So was this actually a property? Then our fill color, our background color is going to be black. Otherwise, our background color is going to be white. So it's a very, very simple component again. But there's one thing that we've added that we haven't been using elsewhere in any of our projects up till now. And that's this logo was defined but never used. No, I'm not worried about that. Let me get rid of it. So that quits yelling. There we go. But one thing that's different here is we've got this prop types bit. So we haven't been using this in any of our code up till this point, and it's not something that's required. It's just something that's useful. It's a useful tool, right? So this is something that's built on top of React. It's an extra mechanism that when you're building large applications on a team, if you're used to a language like C# or you've programmed in other languages, they have what's known as like strong typing. So if something is a string, it's always a string. You can't convert a string. You can't look at a string and a number and have that work, right? And throughout the code, it'll always know, like this square class would know that this black property that it takes in is a Boolean. That's part of like a programming language like C#. It knows that it has to be a Boolean. And if you ever pass something in that's not a Boolean into it, it's going to you're going to have a compile error. Your code's not going to be able to be built to run. But JavaScript, as we've all seen, is flexible, right? JavaScript lets we can compare to the string to the number, and it'll convert between them. It doesn't have strict typing, and there's no way to tell it, this parameter has to be this type in the language. You can't say like, oh, the parameter of my function, the first parameter has to be a Boolean. You can pass anything in. So this is just a way to add a little bit of that type checking around your code during development. So it's some extra stuff that's built in or part of this prop types library, so that when you're in sort of a development mode and you're testing this stuff out, this will complain if you ever try to pass in a black property that's not a Boolean value. So it's just sort of an extra error handling mechanism to help you write code that's better. It really, I mean, you may be thinking like, that's not very hard. I'm going to know what the property is that I'm trying to pass in. But when you get on larger teams, it's really useful because it communicates what this is. Like you can imagine, instead of you having written this component, somebody else wrote this component and you're just using it. And you're like, oh, here's the properties that the component can take. It can take black, it can take position, it can take, piece, it can take all these other properties. And you might be like, yeah, but what is black? Like, what do I pass in for that? I don't know what type of value I need to give it to make it work. And this is a way to communicate a lot of that between different people working on the same project.
One question also, seeing that we're extending a component, we're skipping the constructor phase in this, so.
We are, and we're skipping that. I mean, really the only reason is because we're not doing anything that needs the constructor. So this could arguably be a functional component too, because there's no, the only time that you really need something that's not a functional component is when you're managing state inside of your component. Everything else could arguably be functional components. But you only need to call the constructor and call the super and do all of that if you need to do some work inside of the constructor yourself. Like you need to set some state or you need to hook up some of your own functions, because implicitly it will call the super and the constructor automatically.
Okay, so in this context, maybe the board would be more likely to do something like that.
Yeah, the board might be more likely to do that. And we'll see if I can't remember if it does or not, but essentially, if you're not going to be doing anything yourself in the constructor, you don't have to write it because it implicitly does that work for you of calling the super and everything else. So now we've got a square. And you can see it's like, now I changed my entry point. So we'll just change our bit of code that we have to look like that, except ours is here in the app, which is fine. So we can import square from square. Now we can wrap our knight in that. And it rebuilds. And if we go look, we should now see something's not right there. Maybe I did something wrong. Did I import my square wrong? Did I not save my square yet? I think I'm all saved here. Let's see. This looks like it's building just fine. You want to inspect it? See if I got any. Let's try this again. All right. What do I have wrong here? I'm going to try one thing here to simplify it. I'm going to get rid of this app div that we were wrapping it with. I don't see anything changing. There's the possibility, I don't know if this prop types thing is properly imported. So there's a possibility that's causing an issue. But that's not it. Anyone tell me? I honestly don't know what I did wrong right now.
The author said he made some mistakes on his one.
What's that?
On the tutorial, it says he made some mistakes. But I don't know if that's.
Oh, okay. That maybe there's a mistake right now. So sadly the screen is empty. Okay, yeah, look, I need to keep going. I forgot to give square any dimensions, so it just collapses. I don't want it to have any fixed size, so I'll give it width 100% and height 100% to build a container. I forgot to put this .props.children inside the div returned by the square. Oh yeah, that's good. So we'll see that, but I'll give it a size first, or a space, I guess. I'm going to do it as two separate steps. So using the ES6, I'm not actually going to use all of this. Oh, and you can see here how he solves the changing the color of the component as well. I'm going to get rid of this first, but so the changes that were made here, that's a good point, is it adds this stroke bit, which we'll come back and talk about in a moment. But now it just gives a width and a height to the components. So now we should have, when I save this, I hope, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to center this stuff again, because I think that's all that app did. For the most part was center some things. Maybe because I don't have anything in it at all. Some text real fast. So there's our square or whatever. It's got some text, right? But we're not seeing the night. And this is a pattern we haven't used too much, but it's very common with React. So anything that, when you render this square here and you've got your night inside of it, that's the child of this square. And it becomes the child property. So you can, if you want to access that inside of it, let's go back to what it was originally here. It's just this .props.children. I guess it becomes children property, which is either one item, like one React element, or an array, one or the other. So that's how you can make it generic, so that it will render your children, whatever children you pass into it, inside of it, right? So that way the square doesn't have to know what item is getting rendered inside of it. All it knows is just render the children up here at this app level right now, is where we told it to put this night inside of that square. Does that make sense? That's a really, really powerful tool, because that lets the square be generic. It doesn't have to know anything else. And then going back, touching on that fill color, all that is doing is saying the actual color or stroke. That just means what our pin color is. So that's how we're changing the color of the piece to be either white or black. We're saying it's the opposite of whatever this black Boolean value is. Get a feel for where we are time-wise. So his takes up more space. I think ours takes up less because it's inside of this app right now. But we'll worry about that. Maybe I'll rip that off so that we'll see if it works then. Oh, it still didn't. I don't know. It's finally time to get started with the board. I'm going to start with an extremely naive version that just draws the same single square, right? And this is, again, I think this is just a great tutorial for learning how to build stuff up, because you don't always have to try and do everything at once. Start with the simple approach, the simplest thing, and then add stuff in over time. So now for our board, if we look at this, we're not doing anything particularly fancy at all here. We're just pulling in a square, pulling in a knight, and rendering the same thing that we were just rendering in our app for the most part, right? The only difference here is we've got one thing that we're saying is part of our prop types. Knight position is going to be a prop that we expect the board to take. And the knight position is an array of numbers. And it's going to be a required property. But right now, we're not even passing that in. So actually, we'll be able to see that as an issue in a moment. We're going to change our import here now. Just import our board. If we don't have our knight or our square at this level, we can get rid of those imports. And now we see this error over here, right? Failed prop type. The prop knight position is marked as required, but it's not. Its value is undefined. That's what this prop type tool is giving us, because we didn't actually pass anything into our board. We didn't give it a knight position at all, right? But you can see here is like he passed one in even if it's not being used. So if we just take that exact same mechanism, we're going to pass a knight position in, even if we don't do anything with it right now. And now we render the app again. That complaint is gone because the property is exactly what it expects it to be. It's an array of numbers. And so that's just all that is there for you as a developer, as a troubleshooting tool or a way to make sure you're writing your code correctly. It doesn't compile and doesn't prevent your code from running. You could see that we rendered the board anyways. It's just a way to help you and your team make sure that you're doing what your components are working the way you expect them to work. Is everyone with us so far? I mean, this is just building out the simple React piece, right? So the first half of this tutorial will pretty much be we're getting these React components in place that we're going to be using, and then we're going to start doing the drag and drop bit, which will be a little more complicated. So we go. Indeed, see a single square. I'm not going to add a whole bunch of them, but I don't know where to start. What do I put in render? Some kind of a for loop, a map over some array. To be honest, I don't want to think about it now. I already know how to render a single square with or without a knight. I also know the knight's position thanks to the knight position prop. This means I can write the render square method and not worry about rendering the whole board just yet. Then he has this render square method that we add in pretty much to our board. So if we go over to our board and we're going to add in this render square, but I don't think it's actually, let me check and look at it real fast. Render square, you must make it part of the, part of this, I'm guessing. It's indented then. There we go. So it's adding this render square method. Oh wait, I'm in the app. I don't want it here. I want it in my board. Patient's all funky, but I don't care. We've added render square, and if we look at this, it's pretty simple. It just says we're rendering a square x, y. There's some weird logic here to decide if the square is black. Let's act like we don't need to worry about that too much. It's just it's a simple algorithm to say whether or not it should be a black or white square. This also looks at the night position off of the props, and it gets the x and the y. So if the x and the y for the square that we're rendering are the same as the night position on this board, then render a night as well. Otherwise, or the piece becomes a night component. And then what we return from this is the square with the piece. But remember, the piece is either null or the night, right? So that way, that's how it decides whether or not for that square it's actually going to render the night into it. And then here, just to test it out, it was like, all right, here's a few squares. So instead of rendering a square directly here, we call this a few times the render square method, rendering a few different squares, and see what happens. Probably screwed something up somewhere. So let's see. So at this point, I realized I forgot to give my squares any layout. So it's probably, I don't even think we can see it, but yeah, they're not positioned the way you expect them to be. We're not saying here's what your sizes are and here's how to lay it out. You're going to use Flexbox because why not? So this is just stating how what the square's position is and size. This is part of CSS to figure out your layout. So we're going to pretty much just, borrow this without too much concern. I think, let's try and look here real fast on what changed. So some of the stuff that changed is this return is going to change, where we're now giving it a style and this key property of I, and that was coming from up here because render square is now taking in an I. So I'm going to redo this whole function or whatever, but what you can see is render square is now taking essentially what square do I need to render, but it's just one number. That it brings in. And the math changed a little bit for how we do some of this stuff, but nothing too dramatic. And then just some styling. The styling, I'm not going to get into too much detail on what it's doing, but since you have, what is it? It's how many squares across in 8, right? 12.5% is how you would divide down so that each one has the right size in both directions. And then down in here now for our render, it's actually going to render all of our squares as opposed to just the 3. And it's doing it by just having some squares array that it's pushing render square in for 0 to 64, because that's how many squares we end up having. And calls render square for each one of those numbers. And all of those are going to get wrapped in this flex, which is just a way to lay stuff out in JavaScript or in HTML. That's a lot easier than old layout approaches. I'm sure I'm missing something. It's probably because of this. Let me get rid of this. What am I missing now? So if I render my squares, I tell them they're all divs. Render each square. Something is wrong here still. There might still be some other styling impacting us from
Maybe the index CSS that he's importing.
yeah. It's possible we're getting some styling that's affecting us from one of these. That definitely played a role. Yeah, I can just get rid of that here too. And it might be that since I'm rendering inside of this app, this guy needs style. Tell it how large to be, because I'm pretty sure up here we would have. Let me check here. It just rendered the board directly. So I'm going to give this. Double. We'll go with that. All right, that's not going to work. I'm going to swap this out and render the board directly. I'm going to take my code from here, do that directly in the index. Oops. Try and remove any possible conflicts that we have. No, I'm missing something else. Done with that. All right. The dangers of doing something live. Let me try and grab this whole file from scratch. See if maybe I missed something. Oh, I think I did. I think I ended up having multiple render squares in there before. Somehow. No? All right, I'm gonna look at this. Where am I? Here's my square. Then I should have another square right here. That is not visible. So my squares, I think the problem here is I'm missing something in my squares, maybe. But it looks like they're not rendering if they don't have a child. Or they're not maybe taking up any space. Yeah. See, it's, if you look at this real fast, you can see it has a height but no width. which is why we don't see any other squares.
We've got the height and width as percentages. Can you just put them in as like absolute pixel values just to see if it'll?
You could, yeah. Like I could, like on a square, for example, you know, I could say a width is, I don't know, 80 pixels. Height is 80 pixels. You know, actually, I don't think I need to do the pixel bit here necessarily, but there we go. So you can see we've got the whole board. It's this styling problem going on. Maybe I can figure out what I did wrong real fast here without spending too much more time on it. Such renders children. Its height and width is this. Div square black. Size. Yeah, I don't know. That's still a little weird to me. I just missed something somewhere about these sizes.
So is there a difference between using percentage and pixels, or it doesn't matter?
There is, in the sense that percentages will change based off the size available, in a sense. So they like if you have 100 pixels of space available to render something, a higher level component said, here's, you know, my width and height is 100 pixels. And then a child says I'm 50% of the height and 50% of the width. It'll be like 50 pixels tall and 50 pixels wide. But now if the parent changes and it's like I'm 200 pixels, you know, wide or something, then that thing will be 100 pixels wide and 50 pixels tall. So it's using the values of its parent to decide how large it's going to be. So it's a way to be dynamic and flexible, so you don't have to change the values across the whole application if you change something. So I feel like what I missed, let me see if I can, is I probably need to define not 100% or something on this root stuff. I need to give it an actual width and height, and that might work. Let me see if that does work. Not certain. So if I give this guy width, might. No. All right, I just missed something in here somewhere, I'm sure. Or, you know, the width and height thing is affecting us at this higher level, and I'm missing how to translate that. Let me look at this again real fast. I go up to my root. So it's got this full width, but it only has a height of 21. Flex wrap wrap. Here's my second item, which has no actual width. So that's what I thought. If I gave this a, maybe I'll try that one more time. This board. Let me give this a set width. You can even just do this. You're doing the React stuff with a number. Like, I'm gonna go with that for now. Fix that later. But there we go. Look, we don't even have the problem that he mentioned now. Our stuff actually has a set width and height. All right, we're gonna skip over that. So we haven't even really gotten into the challenging bit here of the React drag and drop, but I hope it's still been so far a good example of building on another React application. And the cool thing is we've got this night position as an input for our board. And so we can just change that to be any position that we want it to be when we call our board. Like right now it's 0, 0. So yeah, if we want our night at 4, 5, for example, when we render our app, it's over here instead of at that 0, 0 point. And if we, just 1, 1. So then we can render our night in any of these squares. It's rendering just fine. The color is changing already. And we can change its position sort of manually by changing that value, right? So that's sort of cool already. We've got a decent little app that we've got going together. It's declarative much. That's why people love working with React, right? We can even test out the night in all the different positions. But now we want to be able to add that state, right? How can we actually move it? What's the React drag and drop bit? So we want to make the night draggable. It's a noble goal, but we need to see past it. What we really mean is that we want to keep the current night position in some kind of state storage and have some way to change it. That's going back to what I was talking about. We've got some sort of function of setting his position and being able to get it out. It doesn't matter how we do that, whether it's by dragging or whether it's some programmatic way to do it. You can still invoke that no matter what. It says, because setting up the state requires some thought, we won't try to implement dragging at the same time. Instead, we'll start with a simpler implementation. We will move the night when you click a particular square, but only if this is allowed by the chess rules. Implementing this logic should give us enough insight into managing the state so we can replace clicking with the drag and drop once we've dealt with that. This gets into state management. Isn't like React doesn't tell you how to manage state. You could use Flux like we've been using in our tutorial, Redux, RX. It says even Backbone that complains about it. In this case, we're just going to use, I think, state. Oh, he's going to use an observable pattern, I think, actually. So here what he's doing is taking this, what was the index, and going to change it a little bit so that it's creating a sort of game component, if you will, around the board and the square and the night. It says, note that this time I'm writing my code in blind, not being able to run it yet. That's because I'm still figuring out the API. So this goes back to that exact same pattern I was telling you about before, right? This is that pattern of, well, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, how I'm going to manage this state, but I'm going to have some sort of observe, some way to manage it, and I'm going to act like it already exists and code it up as if that's there. So this is where it went into this, I don't think we need the service worker in this. I think we can replace it all. It's where it changed the index so that now there's this observe, which is coming from this game, and we can say, oh, we failed to compile because we don't have a game, which doesn't export an observe of any kind, right? So what would be the next step at that point? Create that, right? We acted like it existed because we want to build something out this way. And what observe is going to take here is it takes a function that takes a night position as its argument and returns the rendering of your React application, passing in the night position that it took. So, all right, we'll create this game.js file. And we could step over here, but we could even just arguably start writing something out here right away. Like we could be like, all right, we're going to have some sort of function, which is observe, which we know this takes a function, and then it's going to return something out of that. And then when we're done with this, because this is a named export as opposed to an unnamed export, which means we're using this parentheses to get the actual thing out, we'll be exporting it named. So it'll be something like export observe. That's how we'll be able to invoke it, right? So at this point, actually, and I haven't even gone back to the tutorial, but you can see we actually built now. Because we have a game file, it's exporting an observe. It's a function of some kind, so it meets our definition of what observe is. It works just fine here, but we're not doing anything with our argument or anything like that, right? So if you were actually building this out, like that's probably the way I build stuff out is, okay, now I've sort of pseudo done something. And heck, if I'm testing this out now, I may even just do this right now. Like maybe this, let's go and look at what we like wanted it to be. We want it to, it takes a function that renders, so we know it's going to take a function, and what it's going to do is pass in the position to whatever that function is. So some sort of, I don't know what to call this, like our component that we want to render, really a function. We can call that and just give it the positions for our night, like 1, 1. Wait, how is the night position passed in here? It's a single argument, like it's an array, right? So we call it like 1, 1. It works, I don't know. Then it's on the fly. Yep. So we just took what we had before in our index.js, right, and we're hard coding them. We moved it over into this observe function. And now we know that we want to be able to take some sort of function into it and return something. We can test this out and move our night around the same way we were doing it before. But we haven't implemented the actual like core of that observe function. We've been able to act like we're going to solve this later still, even now, which I think is just a really powerful way to think about programming in general, right? So here's what it does for his version of the observe, which looks very similar, except a little different. Here's our function that it's getting in, and then it's called set interval with a ½ second. So every ½ second, it's going to randomly move the night around the board. So you can sort of see it rendering in the different places, right? So that's what this one's doing. And it does it a little different. It doesn't have the export down here, which is fine. And now if we look at it, what we should see is our night sort of jumping around. And does it make sense why it's moving around over time? Because every time what happens is every 500 milliseconds, it calls this function that got passed in, receive, and it gives it a new random position for the night. And that receive function is rendering a React application again every time. Just render, 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 render. Is that cool so far? He's like, this is obviously not very useful if we want some interactivity. We're going to need a way to modify the game state from our components. For now, I'm going to keep it simple and expose a move night function that directly modifies the internal state. It's not going to fare well in a moderately complex app where different state storages may be interested in updating their state in response to a single user action, but in our case, this will suffice. So this gets a little more complex now. And we may not dive too deep into the what's going on here because we're more focused on trying to learn the create react or the react drag and drop logic. What's going on is there's some night position being stored here. It's creating this observer bit. It's creating a function that can call this observer with the new night position, and then observe is O, and all that's doing is setting this observer value up here to that function, right? So that's just adding another wrapper level around things. And then in move night function, which is really simple, it takes an X and a Y that you're going to move to, sets your night position and calls emit change. Emit change just invokes this function, which is actually the render, with the new night position that you just set. So this is acting a lot like what would be like a class or a function, almost a function by itself, except it's just wrapped it up inside this module instead. I need to go grab some water in just a moment. So are we all doing good so far? A little bit confusing at some point, but this last bit maybe, but again, it's not the most critical piece for us in this right now, because that's just creating a way for us to save state, get state and save state and tell it to re-render. So that says, now let's go back to our components. Our goal at this point is to move the night to a square that was clicked. One way to do that is to call move night from the square itself. However, this would require us to pass the square its position. Here's a good rule of thumb. If a component doesn't need some data for rendering, it doesn't need that data at all. So these are useful things to think about, right? If when you're building your next app, if a component doesn't need something to know how to render it, it shouldn't have that data as part of its state. And right now, do our squares need their position to render? They don't, right? So we shouldn't have the square's position data inside of the square, because that would be data that it doesn't need for rendering, but now it needs just for some other piece of logic. So it says the square doesn't need to know its position to render, therefore it's best to avoid coupling it to the move night method at this point. Instead, we are going to add an on-click handler to the div that wraps the square inside the board. So if we go look at our render square here, inside of our board, well, inside of our board, we're adding a few new bits. Now we're adding a connection to move night, right? Is the first thing. So now our board also is going to know how to move the night. But when does that get called? That gets called inside this render square, or set up inside this render square. It actually gets called inside this handle square click, which is fine, but it gets set up inside renders. I don't even know what I did there. Dictionary search. All right. I am a competent Mac user. So our render square here, we're going to swap that out, indent that. And it's pretty much the exact same. The only difference is for each one of the squares that we're rendering inside of a div, we added a click handler that says when you click on this square, essentially this div, then call handle square click with the X and Y value that the board knows are the right X and Y values for this square. So the board has that knowledge, so it's the place where we're hooking up this logic, right? Okay, well now we're missing handle square click, which is fine. It's just the next bit of code right here. And all handle square click does is call to the move night to say move him to that position, right? So handle square click is just another function right down here inside of our board. And now at this point, we should have the ability to move our knights to any square that we click on, right? And the great part is that's not bound to dragging or anything. We could do that a lot of different ways. This move knight function could still be called at a set interval to move him to different positions. You know, there's no binding from the UI saying this is the only way to do this to actually performing the action. As a note here, we could have also added an on-click prop to square and used it instead, but since we're going to remove the click handler in favor of the drag and drop interface later anyways, why bother? So we could have, instead of having it on this div, we could have put it on the square here, but there was no reason to do that. So then it's a good note. What's the next step here that we've talked about? Like, what can we do here with our knight that's wrong right now?
You can move it everywhere.
Can move it everywhere, right? But if you're familiar with the rules of chess, this knight can move here right now, but he can't move here. That's an invalid move. And so I'm gonna just steal this. I'm not even gonna really worry about it too much. Here's some magic math about moving the knight. The knight can't just move to any arbitrary square. It's only not allowed to make L-shaped moves. I'm adding a can move knight function to the game and changing the initial position to A2 to match the chess rules. So you'll see we change our initial position of our knight, so it's where a knight would be at the start of a game. And we can see that really easy. And then add this little bit of can move logic. Is this a valid place for him to move to? And the can move logic is getting the current knight position. Like, where is he at right now? And then it's going to do some magic based off the current position and where you're telling it you want to go to tell you if it's a valid move. But we haven't hooked that up anywhere yet. So now that we added that, the next bit is we can hook it up in this handle square click, right? So when we click on a square, if it's a valid place to move to, go ahead and move our knight. Which that's back over here on our board. Our handle square click just changes a little bit. So, oops. I just meant to put it around this. Nice. Nice indentation. Yeah, that didn't backfire at all. It's all so wrong. All right. Oh, I didn't import can move knight. No, I don't want to call it. I just want to import it. So now, cross our fingers, everything's going well. We can't move here. We can't click here. We can't click here. Oh, we can, because that's a valid move. Sorry, wasn't paying attention. Valid, right? Valid place to go to. But now we can't move there, but we can move here right now. So now we've built the basic rules around how to move a knight around our board, right? So I'm going to take a quick break. I'm going to go get a glass of water. And then we can come back and start talking. We probably won't get all the way through this. How we're going to add drag and drop on top of this knight piece. And that'll start getting into how we're hooking up all this drag and drop stuff. But I think this was worth going through the initial part anyways, just showing how to build another application. Like, this is a much simpler application than what we've built, but another application being built in React, and how you can go about thinking about it, how to break stuff down and work through it. I'll be back in just a moment.
I came prepared.
What?
I came prepared.
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
Sorry. No, I forgot.
My bag smells good right now. I went to the bakery before coming here. I know. I got my breakfast,
Nice.
but I haven't eaten it yet.
What would you get?
A scone.
No.
Chocolate almond.
I like this one.
Yeah, I like that. I kind of already like understand sort of like more than like from the first tutorial that we started doing.
Yeah.
It's just like I have no idea. Here it's like, oh yeah, I get.
See y'all on Tuesday. I gotta split.
It started from scratch, so it's kind of like kind of get it.
I just.
You stole all your passwords.
You stole all my passwords from my my key pass bit.
Yeah.
Here. Oh, that's not good. Look, I take all these security measures. Uh-oh, now you guys get to see me be really geeky. Get out of that. That's not my Dungeons and Dragons character. No,
I have no idea.
that is not. Take all these security measures and then just leave my password manager open. How silly of me. All right, so we've got a working app now, right? The application's doing what we want it to do and what we're really aiming for by the end. But we've got a few things we'd like to add in, which is including drag and drop, right? That's the main purpose of doing all of this. But I hope what we've done so far sort of shows that the functionality, the underlying functionality of being able to set the pieces doesn't need to be tied to the way that you do something in the UI. And that's a general rule of thumb. Whenever you're building stuff, think about the UI shouldn't be tied to how something's being done, because when you do that, then it's going to be much harder to change your pattern. Like maybe we do want this click mechanism, and if we had tied it all just to the dragging behavior, then it would have been much harder for us to pull that out and build it separately. So now let's get into building out our drag and drop portion, right? So the first thing we need to do, we need to add drag and drop to our project. So we've got an npm install. We're going to run here. Oh, it's Control C, right? And this is just going to install the different drag and drop pieces in our project here. Hopefully this will work. I do not know if that installed. Let's try it one more time. All right. I hope it's there. We're going to find out real fast. And so this React drag and drop project is broken out into a few different pieces. The core of React drag and drop, and then different ways to actually handle dragging and dropping. So this one's using like HTML5, because in HTML5, there's a way to say like this thing is draggable and to handle those events. But that doesn't work very effectively for touch-based dragging because it doesn't actually support dragging with your finger in the same way. So that's why they've got separate backends for touch. Like here's a touch backend instead. If you ended up needing to support this on a mobile device, you'd want to use the touch backend instead of just the HTML5 one. But that's not the important part here, right? It's not what we're really trying to get at. We're just bringing in what we need for our components. So the first thing we're going to do now is we're going to set up this drag and drop context and telling it we're using an HTML5 backend. So what's going on here is this is sort of this wrapper around the whole portion of the application that says this part of our app supports dragging and dropping in this way. This should look somewhat similar to what we've done with are done with our alt/flux implementation, where we've done this sort of compose wrap around bits, except here, instead, we're wrapping with this drag and drop context. So the drag and drop context is a function that takes the type of drag and drop interface we're going to be using, and then that returns a function that takes the component that you want to wrap your context around. So that's all that's happening here is you've got these two functions, duplicate export. Oh, let's change this. This isn't an export anymore because we're exporting down here now where after we wrap around our drag and drop context. So it's a little confusing to see stuff written like this. At least it still is to me. And I've been reading this stuff for a couple of years, but remember, just break it down bit by bit. This is a function that takes something and then obviously returns another function because we're immediately invoking another function again. And again, this bit here, the drag and drop context, is what's saying, all right, this whole portion of our app is what you can use HTML5 drag and drop around. The next bit you need to do for React drag and drop is we need to tell it, like we need to give it a way to say what you're dragging and what can be dragged in different ways. So here we've got, it says now I'm going to create the constants for the draggable item types. We're only going to have a single item type in our game at night. It's creating a constants module that exports them. So we'll do the same thing. Oops. Why do I do this all the time? I don't know how to use my trackpad. Constants.js. And all we're doing is just creating a constant in here. Really pretty simple. Does anybody remember what the difference is between a const and a let or var in JavaScript?
When can we change?
You can't change.
You can't change the value of a const. That's right. So this is just using const as a way to say, like, these things should not change. This is something set in stone. There's no need to modify this. So now that we've got that, the next bit is telling, we're hooking up all this React drag and drop. So we've told it the context is this whole board supports it. And we've started to define what's going to be allowed to be dragged. But now we have to tell it, connect that to say what items actually are draggable. And that's what's going on here. The drag source higher order component accepts 3 parameters. This is where you get into a whole bunch of complexity around the way React drag and drop works. Type, spec, and collect. Our type is the constant we just defined. So that's telling it, here's the type of thing I'm dragging. So we now need to write a drag source specification and a collecting function, aka this spec and this collect for the night. The drag source specification is going to be ridiculously simple. This is because there is nothing to describe. There's literally a single draggable object in the whole application. If we had a bunch of chess pieces, it might be a good idea to use the props parameter and return something like piece ID props.id, but in our case, an empty object will suffice. I cannot remember where this goes from when I went through this tutorial a long time ago. Constant night source. We'll see. We'll see where this ends up going. Right now, I'm going to put it with my night just as a way to place it somewhere logically, but this will probably end up moving somewhere else because I don't think that's where it belongs. What's going on with this drag source bit here? This spec for it is it's a way for, and we'll see this a little more, but it's a way for the application to communicate with React drag and drop what you're dragging. I think is what it's trying to say. So if we had a whole bunch of different pieces, like if we had an actual chessboard here, in this begin drag, what you would need to be able to tell it is what piece is actually being dragged here. Like, oh, this is your, this is the white queen. This is the, black knight 1 or something like that. But we don't need to do that because there's only one piece that can be dragged. However, when we translate this over into our notes, our Kanban app, right, we're going to have to be able to say a little bit more about what we're dragging because we've got different notes. So it makes sense what we'll probably have, and I haven't, again, it's been a long time since I've looked at that chapter, haven't gone through it recently, but it makes sense if we're trying to communicate something about what we're dragging, what do we think we'll most likely say we're dragging in there? The note, the ID maybe, right? So if we tell it, here's the ID of the note you're dragging, that's a way to say what's being dragged. And that's not used to know how to like show that it's being dragged on the page. That's used to communicate to the drop targets, like what's going on. So that's what it's for. In ours, like it says, there's nothing. So we just have an empty object. Next, we're going to write a collecting function. What props does the knight need? It will sure need a way to specify the drag source node, like where am I dragging from? It would also be nice to slightly dim the knight's opacity when it is being dragged. Therefore, it needs to know whether it is currently being dragged. Oh, look, it did put these in with the knight. How nice. So here's the collecting function. And this stuff will make more sense as we put it all together. It is very confusing. Like literally every time I have to write stuff with React drag and drop, I always have to come back to this tutorial. So recognize that this is not something that's so easy that, oh yeah, I just know how to do this. I have to come back to this because it's got a lot of just very specific syntax and behavior. I'm always coming back and referencing this again. But this is hooking up a couple different things. It's saying, what are you dragging? And that's how you hook up to the piece or that UI element to say what's sort of being dragged. And this is dragging gets injected into your component, which you guys will see in a minute, to tell it that it's being dragged so that you can do something about, change the way you render while you're dragging. So an example of that stuff, all right, now we need to import our drag source into our knight, and we need to import it because we're calling drag source stuff right around here. Oh, they also brought in prop types and constants. Oh yeah, we'll definitely need those. And we'll get to see why in a moment. So this is that knight source bit that we just had. This is the collecting function we defined, which will make a little more sense in a minute. And now our knight gets a lot more complex in terms of the way it renders. So I'll pull all this over and start talking in more detail about what we just changed about our knight here. So I mean, one obvious thing, right, is we're not exporting up above, we're exporting down here, and we're wrapping it in some way again. So this can get a little redundant, I know. Some of this is basic, but I think it's a good exercise. Like, what is this little line doing? You don't have to know what the functions are doing, but what's going on here describing like the language model of what's happening. So drag source is it's a function, right? And it takes these 3 parameters. And then what does drag source return?
The knight function.
What?
The knight function.
It returns a function that takes a component. So drag source is a function that takes 3 parameters, which just like we just saw the same type of thing on the drag and drop context. It then returns another function that takes a night. So you could write this out more verbosely, right? Like you could say, if you wanted to write this out more explicitly, you could do like a let night drag source wrapper or something like that equals this drag source. Because it just returns a function. And now this would be night drag source wrapper, which takes a night, like what you're wrapping. That's a completely valid way to write this as well. It's just very common shorthand to write it out without creating this extra variable in between.
Drag source wrapper.
Right, it's something that takes a night and is going to wrap it with something else, right? And we're going to see what that's being wrapped with in just a moment when we go up and start looking at our night, right? So our night before, like the properties that we pass into our night, the only one that we're passing in, oh, did the night have any properties before?
The starting position.
It didn't even have a position. Remember, the board rendered the piece. So our night had no properties, right? In our earlier version, it just rendered the little night Unicode character. But now we've got some properties in our night, right? We have this is dragging and this connect drag source. So the question is, if we step over to our board where we render a night, are we passing any properties into our night? We're not, right? It's not getting anything. So where are those properties coming from? That's what that wrapper bit that I just talked about was. This wrapper is injecting these properties into the night, is dragging and connect drag source. So it's adding properties to this night component that didn't come from outside. They're coming from this React drag and drop wrapper, if you will, that's adding stuff in there. And of course, those map right here to connect drag source and is dragging, because that's what we said we were adding to it. So now we have connect drag source is dragging that we can use inside of our night. We also have this. So then inside of there, here's our connect drag source. We're using one of the properties that we added in, and that property is just what is connect drag source? If you just look at the code real fast, say, all right, it's got a parentheses at the end of it. So what is it? It's a function of some kind, right? So, maybe we don't know the details beyond that, but it's a function. And it takes a component of some kind added into it as well. Except what it has to have, at least in React drag and drop, is it has to be actual DOM stuff. So this couldn't be like another React component, like a square. It has to be like a div or a span, unless they've changed that, which I don't think they have, which is why it wraps directly around this content right here. And what it's doing is connecting this drag source information in here, which we'll see a little bit more about what that means. But we're also using this other property here, is dragging, and we're using that to set an opacity value on this component. And that's going to be based on whether or not we're dragging it. I am not running right now, am I? All right, let's start up again. Start building. And I may be missing something still at this point, so everything might not be hooked up. But let's see what we have. So if you look at this, you should start to see like I can't drag this, but you notice I'd get this sort of different icon, and it's actually draggable in some way. But when I'm dragging it, you can see behind it. That's because of that opacity setting that's being changed based off is dragging. So the way it's rendering this night component is such that when you're dragging, it's semi-opaque or whatever, so you can see partway through it. And when you're not dragging, it's not. So there's a little bit of magic going on here, but it should also, at least partially make sense. There were some other, I think I've got some styling problems with this because, this whole thing is showing up as opposed to just the, what?
Just the night.
Just the night, yeah. I think I've got some weird styling issues going on. I can deal with that later. Let's see where we're at. So we're definitely going to have to continue this next time. I don't want to, take you guys too far past, but we do have a night that's sort of draggable now, right? But we don't have any drop targets, so that's the next thing we're going to need to do. It says, this time we can't avoid passing the position to the square when we do the drop target bit. After all, how can the square know where to move the drag knight if the square doesn't know its own position? So now the square needs to know its position, sort of. On the other hand, it still feels wrong because the square as an entity in our application has not changed. And if it used to be simple, why complicate it? When you face this dilemma, it's time to separate the smart and dumb components. You'll see there's a lot of different terms used for this: smart and dumb, view and container, connected and presentation. These all sort of mean the same thing. What that means is you want to have a component that's really just concerned with how do I render? What do I look like? How do I put myself on the page way? And then a lot of times you'll have a component wrapping that has logic and sort of your application logic. That way you could reuse those dumb bits, like, oh, this is just a button. I want to reuse this button. I don't care about application logic, but something could wrap it above so it changes the label for the button based off the states or something like that. That way you can reuse that same button over and over. So in this case, we introduce a new component called the board square. Board square is going to render the square, but it's also aware of its position. In fact, it's encapsulating some of the logic that the render square method inside the board used to do. So again, sticking with this ES6 syntax, and if you look, you can go back and forth and look at these other versions, which I think is really powerful to see what changes between them. But now we're going to have a board square. I'll move this out. We'll talk a little bit about the board square, and that'll probably be the time for today. Just to respect your time, I don't want to have people go over. And we'll continue this next time and then get into the actual final chapter as well. But I hope by going through this, it's going to make it a lot easier when we go through that final chapter. So here's the board square. And if we look at this, we can see that a lot of this logic here, this X, Y, or the whether I'm black or not, position logic, etc., and then taking the props, children, and stuff, that looks like we pretty much stole it straight out of, a little bit of it straight out of this render square logic up here, right? Deciding if I was black or not. I'll have to come over here, the XY. So this actually is expecting to get an XY passed in. But that means we can probably assume what we're going to do here is and I'm gonna probably have to cut and paste because I'm gonna do this wrong, but this square is going to become a board square. Now it's gonna yell at me saying, hey, you haven't imported that. So let's just change our import from square to a board square. And our board square doesn't need to know if it's black, it needs its X and its Y positions instead. And then this guy is a board square as well. I'll bet you I did that a little bit wrong. We'll see what he changed over here. Now he refactored a little differently, you know, pulling the render piece logic out somewhere separate. But it's very, very similar, right? It's almost the exact same thing. The only difference here was, as I'm saying, the only real difference is this logic here, that's deciding whether or not it's to render a night, also got separated out into a separate function, which was render piece. No, need to indent all this. So render square is pretty much exactly the same as what we had just shown. The only difference was render piece now decides whether I return a night and actually render it in that location. And we should, haven't tested it. Expected a string for built-in components. Oh, we must have something else that we need to make a change for farther up. Hold on. Let me check here. Oh, I haven't actually saved my board square. There we go. I think maybe we're good now. So there we go. We didn't actually, and this is how I would build it out step by step like that, right? So we created this board square component because we said, all right, we need some logic at that level. So let's refactor our code. That's the terminology where you're taking something that you're not changing the way your code works in any way, or you're not changing the way it works for the end user. You're only changing the way it's structured. So when you're changing the structure of your code, but you want the code to give the exact same result as it was giving before, whether that's the UI, the behavior, that's called a refactor. So all this board square bit so far was us refactoring our code so that some of that square position logic came out of the board and into this board square component. That was all that we did with that up till this point. And then we'll just continue with this next time, talking about how to hook up the drop target. I mean, we're almost done. But there's a few bits left to get it sort of moving nicely, and then to add in our ridiculous different image when we're dragging. So we'll come back and finish this up, and then dive into the final chapter of the actual book next time. Quick, just general poll. Was it useful to go through this tutorial separately?
Yep. Yes.
I think so. So that we weren't mixing them together. I thought it would be myself. I've gone through it. I thought it was one of the better tutorials I went through when I was learning React in general. So it's just much smaller. It's not as big as our Kanban, so it wasn't really enough to build a class off of in the first place. All right.